piece that you wrote. You had a great one at DawgNation.com while I was on vacation, looking at the fact that Georgia kind of chose to stand pat regarding the transfer portal, something that last year did not do, and certainly this year puts it in direct contrast to so many other teams around the country that obviously have taken a ton of transfer players. Before we let you go, just kind of give us a little bit of a snapshot of what you wrote, because I thought that piece deserved to be highlighted, because I think it does kind of set up a situation right now where Georgia's just very different than a lot of the teams around college football.
All right, well, I'm pretty sure I figured out what the audio issue was. So
well, there you go.
It sounds better there. Naturally, at the end of the show, it's when it happens.
Well, I'll keep you. Listen, if we got the audio figured out, I'll keep you longer. But go ahead, please.
So, and I don't know why I went Canadian there for a second, but you look at Alabama, and I think one of the sneaky interesting things from their sort of offseason is, they go out and they add Jermaine Burton, they add the wide receiver from Louisville, they add a couple of different transfers there, and it's interesting that a program that is recruited as well as Alabama has is still plugging those holes, and transfers are not a zero-sum game. If you're bringing somebody in, that likely means that you're pushing somebody else down the depth chart, a guy that you recruited and wanted to develop there. So it's interesting to me that Georgia, unlike an Ohio State, unlike even a Clemson this year, went out and brought in somebody else and didn't bring anyone else. And they are rolling with the guys that they brought and the guys that they had in terms of recruiting, in terms of developing. And, part of it is I do think it falls into the way the transfer portal sort of shook out this year, and there just wasn't an obvious superstar safety out there that was able to come in and could have helped this team. Maybe there isn't the right wide receiver that they were looking for. Whereas, for example, last year, Darian Kendrick checked every box for what Georgia needed and what Georgia wanted there. And so I think because of that, you do have, the examples that Kirby Smart has laid out and in the past of, that's why we don't like to necessarily rely on the transfer portal, because the guys that you might need aren't always going to be in there. And so you're going to have to develop year over year. And so I do think that shows a little bit why Georgia is going about the way that they are about the transfer portal, where if there's a no doubt about a guy that we think can help us, we'll go get him. But more often than not, we're going to want to rely on high school recruits and those type of players. I think Ole Miss brought in something like 17 different transfers this offseason, and it's going to be really interesting to see how that all sort of works out and how that team sort of gels. Because, quite frankly, with the way, we've never seen any team be that transfer heavy before, whereas college football has shown us time and time again, if you're able to recruit and you're able to do well at that level, it's going to end up paying off in the long run.
Yeah, listen, to me, there's two things going on here. Like, Ole Miss is taking all those transfers because they can't recruit well coming out of high school. Lane Kiffin's is not a very good recruiter. Ole Miss doesn't have quite as much to sell. They are going to have to be relying on the transfer portal because they can't recruit out of high school. However, I think you would agree with me on this, Connor. No program would choose, unless you're like a group of five or I guess an FCS, I think you probably would choose transfers. But for SEC level programs, they'd obviously much rather win high school recruiting battles than transfer portal recruiting battles, because you just have more long range gain from that. You have a chance to keep a player 2 or 3 years, where in the case of most transfers, it's going to be a 1-year proposition. That's not a very efficient way to run your program when you're constantly battling for players you can only keep for a year. But here's the other thing, and this to me is the most important. There is no free lunch when it comes to transfers. On the one hand, bringing in a guy like Darian Kendrick was obviously great for Georgia a year ago. But if you have a lot of guys like that who have not played with each other before, how they play together is still going to be a bit of a mystery. If they've all come from different cultures, they all come from different teams, different parts of the world, it is not a guarantee they are going to gel the way that you need a team to gel. This is still not fantasy football. This is still not, hey, just throw 11 talented guys out there and they'll just figure it all out. Sometimes talent actually doesn't figure it out. There is something to be said for how you play together, and when you bring in a lot of transfer players, you may be upping the talent level on your team, and that's always a good thing. But the trade-off to that is you are bringing in a little bit of mystery about how well your guys will click and play together. And by the way, who you make disgruntled, who you make unhappy because you brought in a transfer to kind of park above him on the depth chart, which obviously did not work out well for Alabama a year ago. I'll give you the final word.
Right, and I'll give you a perfect example of that. If Darian Kendrick doesn't come in last year, there's a good chance maybe Jalen Kimber is still with this program and playing. And Jalen Kimber is obviously a player that is still very well thought of. He's at Florida and is probably going to end up starting for them this year. And obviously he had a shoulder injury that I think slowed him down last season. But, Kendrick is a one-year stopgap, and granted, all SEC player, MVP, defensive MVP, the Orange Bowl, a great player, but I think more often than not, you'd rather take a guy, as you point out, that you can have for 2 or 3 seasons, guys that you can develop over that period of time. Whereas, if you're just taking all these one-year guys, Tyke Smith is another perfect example of this, where, things don't work out for him last year. He has a foot injury, and then he tears his ACL. And if you're counting on him to be a big-time contributor and you're disgruntling some of your other transfer players, it's going to make things tough to consistently build a winner year in, year out, because eventually the transfer portal is just going to run dry and they're not going to have the players that you need in there. So I think in rare circumstances you're going to see a Georgia go for it if there's sort of a perfect fit. And even as we get more and more into the transfer portal, Kirby Smart doesn't want to take group of 5 players. While that has worked out for some people, the FCS group of 5 players, that hasn't really worked out for Kirby Smart and what he sort of wants from there. I know J.R. Reed is a great counterexample of that, but more often than not, they're taking Power 5 guys. And even from there, I think there's another level that you might want to see them get to, of taking guys from power programs like, say, Clemson, like, say, an Ohio State, a Michigan, theoretically, of guys that compete at those sorts of levels that are at championship caliber programs already. And for whatever reasons, things don't work out at the prior programs, but Georgia has the infrastructure in place to get out of those players this year.
Connor, good stuff. Thanks so much for being with us here today. We'll look forward to reading a lot more from you at DawgNation.com and chat with you in the program again very soon there as well.